part of our Champion Edition bot checkup. The 2MK team brings you another set of V triggers to verify the status of everything. So, in we go. Today we're looking mostly at zoners, but we'll be starting with Laura since she's the one here that does not match the rest of what we're probably going to be looking at. And a good start off given what Laura Bot is for. Laura Bot's primary purpose is to train meaty attacks, specifically ones where you have to either eyeball it, or if you're not familiar with the timing or have some problem executing the timing for most of what you're doing. We've given her V-Trigger 2 in this case, and we're about to turn back on all of her inputs. We were just verifying that she is fine because this Laura Bot is actually not our standard, the one you find online. It is a slight variation. We're still working on this one, in fact, to the point where we're still not absolutely sure that we should release it, but she does still have most of her functions on. So if you are someone who has our other Laura Bot, and this one looks a little unfamiliar, don't worry about it, she's mostly the same. In this case, therefore, you get to see Laura's V-Skill 2 in action. Most of the time she will do this as a jump into a kick. She does have other options, but they're not as important or relevant to anything anyway, and to teach the bot to do them would be difficult. Mainly, this still works out more or less. A lot of what you are trying to do against this bot is watch the air, make sure you get things correct, and if you block this attack and don't anti-air or air-to-air her, she will get not necessarily advantage, but it's a little bit ambiguous at least some of the time. Overall, you can see that her main flows work fine. A beginner might have some trouble with it, especially because she's technically better this way. But again, this is our higher level Laura bot, so you're likely to see Laura on another stream. We're just showing off the fact that even if we did happen to release the 1.4, as we call this version, it would all be okay because it just works as is. In terms of Laura being shifted, because her V-Skill 1 and V-Skill 2 are very similar in terms of when they move you and why they move you, it's not likely to change the part of the bot that's important relative to meaties and similar, because if she was going to wake up with VSO or VSF before, i.e. V-Skill forward or V-Skill overhead, then it's equally, let's say equally ineffective to wake up with multi-spring, as it's called. I'm not sure if that was meant to be spring, but whatever. One of the most important things to understand about the change to Laura Bot though is that it causes her to have less time to use certain moves because she's no longer pushing on you. Even though the animation is basically the same, she's not getting in your face in the same way. She's getting in your face into a more punishable way. Honestly though, you shouldn't be blocking the stat for the most part. You see here, therefore, that the goal should be, almost always, to get the knockdown and counter that move, and then you can continue to use the bot in the standard way. If you counter her with an air-to-air or similar, then you should be able to get some form of meaty after it. Karine is a good candidate for this because she does have an air target combo that does knock the opponent down, but doesn't, by most people's standards, have all that great Oki off of the timing it gives you. So let's watch this a little bit in terms of the flow, because the anti-air aspect of this fight is relatively important. Lara has not necessarily a confusing jump arc, but she has confusing enough other movement that it can become a problem, and adding the jump, or rather the V-skill jump, which has a lower arc, means that you're less likely to be able to respond correctly to all of them. Basically, she gets a move that allows her to add more pressure to you mentally. In Karine's case, it's also good because the knockdown we're speaking of is one where she should not necessarily get her meaty by dashing. Most of us build up our concept of how to get our meaty attacks by dashing because so many of them require it. When you find one that no longer does, it can be a little bit hard to get yourself to not dash simply because your opponent got knocked down. More importantly, it causes the eyeballed meaty situation that Lara bot is for, knowing that you have to walk forward instead, but having to learn the timing for that specific walk, and it can vary by other things as well. So overall, you can probably see that you can continue to use this bot in the way that it was built and what it was intended for. Again, noting that this is the 1.4 version, which is not actually out, but it's similar enough that most people won't have to worry too much. In fact, the other version is just a bit slower, meaning that most of the time you won't even notice. So, with that said, let's start getting into some zoners. We're going to be looking at Ryubot, first of all. Our Ryubot is also a bot that functionally has some variations, but it's more so a variation between the pure bot version and the version we use for the kata. These are, again, not really different enough that you care most of the time. It's extremely unlikely that this is going to be a thing that causes you to decide, well, I can't use this. But there is going to be some shift. We're keeping somewhat on the topic of anti-airs, let's say. Rather than show off Ryu's V-Trigger 2, which is fairly obvious to understand, we're also going to look at what the changes to his V-Trigger 1 do for this bot. Meter-wise, Ryubot actually gets both gauges, whereas Larabot didn't. This is mostly to allow him to do more EX fireballs whenever he needs to. Depending on how he's been done, how he's been input, this can make it easier or worse, but for the most part you should assume it's fine. But now, with the active V-Trigger 1, Ryu no longer loses meter just for throwing projectiles or doing moves. as for the issue of Ryu's new moves, you can see it's fairly obvious that it's not going to affect anything because our Ryu bot doesn't use his V-skill. We've considered developing a new form of the bot that does, but since the V-skill is more or less the same both ways, he is still going to be trying to parry you, and with a much fundamentally less effective parry, in the sense that if a bot does it, it's not really useful. This is the sort of thing that a player must use and make a proper read on. So, much like Cammy, the bot just doesn't have it because there was no... Well, in Cammy's case it's V-trigger, but it's just not used. It doesn't have any effect or purpose to have this available, so it's not. This brings us back to the fact that our Ryu bot is basically unchanged. You're not going to see anything different in the V skill, but you are going to see at least small differences based on the V trigger, which is equally important to look at, which is why we're looking at it now. Ryubot does have the ability, if input correctly, to activate his V trigger, and he won't do it super often, but he can definitely do it often enough to be a problem. And again, depending on the variant you have, he does different things. We will be showing him off in another stream simply because, again, we have different variants and we do store them to check whether or not things are affected like this. Basically, you're not seeing any axe kick, and that's how you tell whether or not it was the kata version or not. So while this is a fully effective Ryubot, it's not the one that you would normally see if you had switched your Ryu in order to make kata 20, make the kata work properly. That's just a note, basically. Bear it in mind. If you had put input our original Ryubot, learned what you had to learn, never touched him since then, based on what you can see here, things are still mostly going to be the same. He's just not a character where we put that level of importance on his V skill, and therefore mostly things like that don't happen. You will in fact see more differences from the other version, even though, once again, the V skill isn't used, mostly because of how projectiles are thrown by that one. And of course, a slight difference in the timings and therefore frequency with which the V trigger is activated. Ryu has had a couple other small changes to the character, but nothing that affects the bot too much in terms of anything relative to either outputs or just general game plan, because it's not heavy enough of an effect to be visible in that way. So use him as you were always supposed to. Learn to punish, learn to deal with things, and in the kata form, learn to deal with jumps in a specific way. Technically, that is also your goal here, but the difference is in how you learn to deal with Hadoukens. And in a sense, this is helpful primarily because of that. If he does go into V-trigger, his Hadoukens change in their properties, and you can spend more time learning how to deal with them or not deal with them. But if you are a beginner and still getting used to this, especially if from that stance you only put in the first version of the Ryubot, don't go worrying about it. The things you need to learn are barely affected, and while he doesn't run out of the V-trigger timer by throwing the fireballs, he does run out of it quickly enough that most of the time it's not going to be your focus when fighting it. Just continue to anti-air, air-to-air, poke him, throw him around, those sorts of things. Bear in mind, of course, that keeping your focus for all this is still going to be hard. As for ways of making sure that he has something useful, we'll check on that later and we'll update anyone based on that. But we are going to move on to our next spot, therefore. We're going to Falke now. Not specifically because she's a particularly good fit for the next in line, but simply because it's easiest. Falke as a character was a bot we created with a very singular purpose. Make sure that the player can get around Falke's movement and zoning most of all. It's not the easiest of things to do, honestly. She is a character that has a lot of different things she wants to do, but gets to stay very mobile while she's doing most of it. And her recent changes have brought us to the conclusion that she's going to be a character where you aren't going to get to fight a lot. But let's head on. Okay then, so Falke uses auto recover on both gauges as well, so as I said, easiest. And your general goal is to go around her, but now she has a slightly more annoying V skill that puts the whole thing back in the same spot. Now you have to worry about her putting up, like, literally a mine. As if it wasn't hard enough to do all of the things the bot requires, now you have this floating thing in front of you that Falke just puts out there. Running into this move is probably one of the better ways to deal with it, and forcing the block, as she's not really a pressury character. And if you have ways around it in other forms, it can be helpful to annoy your opponent with just doing things that they think that the mine will stop you from ever seeing or caring about. Falke as a bot was always built around the idea that if you mess up, she's likely to hit you with her super. That's why she's allowed to spam it. Basically so that you constantly have to deal with the fact that she will be using it and that your health will drop quickly if you make any mistakes. Design-wise as she stands now, we haven't necessarily seen anything good come out of the timing at which the bot does the move. Specifically her V skill. It isn't particularly intimidating and it isn't particularly good for the flow, but at the same time it's really not that terrible either. For the most part it can be ignored or treated about the same as the other, but she does tend to use the EX right afterward, meaning that it depends on how you input her, but for the most part, we're expecting this to not be the most useful of moves. But as you can see, she doesn't have to. She just mostly does. This is related to things like negative edge and a bunch of other little things going on. But it does help keep up the same sort of feeling of, why do I have this character constantly in my face? And by in my face, I mean from across the screen. She's always doing something that makes her hit you from very far away, or makes it so you can't advance. As you can see, the mine is limited, but that does not necessarily mean that it's ineffective. If anything, it tends to mean the opposite, in that it will eventually go away and you can't just jump over it and expect to be fine. Her more creative uses of it are just obviously not in here, and we may of course once again come up with a bot that is based around that idea of utilizing the move better if we start to see that it gets a lot of play and becomes a really important part of matchups or setups. For now though, given the relative ineffectiveness of her V skill from before, relative to the bot's purpose, you can see that this isn't likely to change behavior in any way like that will cause a big problem. We would go so far as to say it makes very little difference whether or not you have her on one V skill or the other, because depending on your character, she's equally effective or ineffective. Whichever one you find more frustrating or difficult to deal with on your character, probably you should just pick that one, because it's very likely that if you are facing an opponent online who understands the same things you do, or at least thinks the same way, then they're going to do the same thing. They will choose the one that they think will be more annoying, or help them more in the matchup. So pick that one. Or if you've realized that you don't know how to fight Falke and you face one, or expect to face one, figure out what they normally use against you and train against that. But overall, she just doesn't throw it out that often. And while she's not specifically predictable in what she does after she throws it out, the bot's flow is not really built around capitalizing on it. Therefore, we will spend some more time trying to find a way to do that properly later. Mostly this would involve giving her the ability to dash up and throw you, because that's the most likely use for it. You being at the wrong position when this move is placed on the field is likely to lead to that sort of thing and cause you some trouble. It doesn't act like a regular projectile. It is a mine, as mentioned, and therefore has some extra things you have to look out for, like when exactly it goes off. But that also means you can use some timing to get through it, and she'll do it just often enough that if you just needed practice against the move itself, not as part of a game plan, just someone is doing it and it's annoying you and you want to be able to use one of your character's tools against it, she will at least do it, which is probably helpful enough for you to get your information at least. And she should do it in ways that would at least occasionally give you an option of understanding how her responses could interact with your options. It may take a while to get it all, but if you're training against Falke in the first place, you probably had a good reason for that. Onward then to Dhalsim. Our Dhalsim bot was based almost entirely around learning to deal with the V-skill. Meaning that of the bots that have functionally lost a lot of their flow and purpose, this is the one that definitely has. What we got in return, though, is something interesting. Dhalsim bot was never one where you got to play a lot of footsies or anything. It was never intended to work that way or that well. A lot of what Dhalsim bot was about mostly had to do with V trigger activations and dashing command throws or knocking Dhalsim down. None of these things have become harder to do. In fact, they've all functionally become easier to do as of this. I believe we had the bot on from before, so. But I'll go through what we have started to see since we did this, because now it's at least interesting. What he now does has a lot more to do with pushing you around on the screen than anything else. And you can think in the same way that you still need to learn to punish the yoga deep breathing. And our bot does have access to EX Yoga Fire, as well as the ability to use the deep breathing to modify things. Basically, Yoga Fire changes properties somewhat while this is going on. And while Dhalsim is technically easier to get in on, that was never the goal, so now you have to at least think about it. Since we made sure that he does have the jump back version of his float, he often therefore has the jump back version of the other V skill. The result is that his teleport becomes more predictable though. Again, making overall the bot easier and less effective at teaching you to deal with that move in the same way. But we figured that that's just no longer the goal. He is still capable of keeping you out. He's still absolutely capable of doing certain things, he just now has a more predictable teleport. And learning to respond to the moments where he chooses to do that move can be considered very important. Changing the various properties of Yoga Fire is important enough that it has a meaning. And if you consider this to now be a very important part of this matchup, you can probably get him to be more effective just by having a certain amount of timing change in using the V skill relative to the teleport timing. We don't have a good idea on that yet, but you might get something still. And it's not as if he's completely incapable of posing a threat after the teleport, it's just that now the player is less likely to be stressed out in the way required because they've just watched him stand there in the air float for a bit. It makes him a little more effective once you are far away from him. And that's always helpful. But this is more so about a Dhalsim player who has a really good handle on the match, using this sort of V-skill to just cement their control. It's not really the sort of thing a bot would use or teach you to deal with easily, because it's not really about the standard flow of, okay, we're doing this now, and this is a setup that any player who wished to play the character could learn in about an afternoon. This is more so proper use of advanced understanding of Dhalsim as a character. You can judge for yourself whether or not this is a good idea or not to face this bot with this. It definitely removes a lot of the initial purpose of it. And depending on your character, it's not really that threatening. It does work somewhat better with his V trigger too, but even that isn't really that big an effect. A lot of how Dhalsim works here is, let's call it luck related. Specifically in that when his actions play together correctly, he's really dangerous, and when they don't, he's not. Since this bot is, however, not the most intimidating overall and was a lot to do with learning to deal with the teleport, as mentioned from the start, this is probably the biggest loss we have in terms of trying to use things relative to a second V skill. Therefore, we're moving on once again. Our next option is Sagat. Sagat bot is about learning how to get your character's jumps to be most effective and getting around or under things that Sagat does. Therefore, we're switching the played character this time, as it will help to demonstrate a bit better. We're not going into too much detail on the specifics of what Sagat bot is for. He's about zoning and getting around fireballs. Let's fix his gauges because he actually does not get the same number of things. And therefore we do this. Now Sagat was built such that his use of his V skill is actually part of his point system, but is very limited. It's not intended to be a thing that happens a lot. And in fact, the rarity of it is part of the challenge, because you need to react very quickly to something he does. Often you have to successfully trigger him to use it by messing with his timing by actually landing damage. Depending on how well you input him, he also won't have certain timings for it at all. But as you can see, the main purpose of it is to change, instead of changing his uppercut, changing his tiger knee. And since Sagat does use both moves relatively effectively, considering, there's not a lot to worry about in terms of his effectiveness. And he does end up charging for not necessarily the same amount of time, but a similar enough amount of time that you should probably react about the same way to it. Meaning that overall, there's no need to change the bot either in terms of what exactly it does, or how you achieve getting points. He can go a long time without using it, which is intentional, because, once again, recognizing that that's what's happening and capitalizing on it is part of the challenge. You can see there he has about the same amount of time, the difference being that in one form he gets the uppercut to use immediately, and the other form he doesn't. He should do the knockdown timing as he always did. So overall, we wouldn't say there's much change here, period. There's nothing really to think about relative to how Sagat works as a character that is changed terribly by the V skill change here. This is just which one does the player feel like using and which one most affects you in the matchup. Because he does take a little bit longer, or rather, the animation is more obvious, you may end up feeling a little more comfortable dealing with this one than the Scar. But it has the same, hey, I can end this slightly early and still get some of the effect bit. So you don't end up thinking, I should always do this and I will always get away with it. Overall, do the same as always. When he does the move, react. You can take your points in the same way. You can choose to respect or not respect it in much the same way, regardless of your character. Whatever you normally do, that's the correct thing to do. Sagat as a character hasn't changed that much by anything in Champion Edition changes, so you don't have to spend a lot of time thinking about that either. I would say, oh well, he does Tiger Knee more often and therefore it's a bigger deal, but not really. Again, this is all more or less just random. Sagat does what he feels like, and you deal with it. That's actually the point. He has a certain number of things he does, and he does them with no easily discernible pattern if he was input well. I mean that you can never say for sure, okay, I've seen this, I therefore expect fireballs. I've seen this, I expect Tiger Knee. You just don't really know. His rhythm doesn't seem to have changed too much either as a result of it. So we're not exactly worried. If you find that your Sagat bot is somehow seemingly more changed, or has a bigger problem than otherwise expected, this has a lot more to do with timings for when the V skill inputs react to other inputs. So be a little careful about it. I wouldn't necessarily say to change or try to fix your bot, but understand that the timing you're using for your training may not be a completely valid timing, and you should try to improve it even if you are managing to land the attack required. But that's all we have to say for Sagat, really. And that allows us to move on to Rashid. Rashid by most standards doesn't count as a zoner, but he absolutely can be played as one. And it's likely that at some later point you will end up seeing that setup, simply because we have more than one Rashid bot. We maybe have mentioned at some point that it was we designed one once, just in case Just Fine needed to face Oil King at Combo Breaker. It worked out later on, but that wasn't specifically what happened. In this case though, Rashid is set differently on gauges, so I'm going to stop him a little bit in order to pull that off. As a character, in terms of V skill and what the V skill means, Rashid is not heavily changed, even though his V skill is very heavily changed. Because Rashid is almost entirely about mobility and being frustrating and distracting with that mobility. Our Rashid bot is basically a pain. His whole purpose is to be a pain about this. He does have good jump back timings and the jump forward timings, and basically just being able to effectively air dash would normally have been bad enough as it is, but he also has, in the bot version, even if he's not input all that well, almost every mix-up he could need to do from that isn't a straight setup on your knockdown. In other words, dealing with people who do this in neutral, the bot will still be enough. However, the good thing about this is it counts as an air move, so nearly all air reactions and air responses still functionally work. The hard part for many people would be making sure that they did it at the timing required, because he has that now. The ability to do Eagle Spike out of this move is one of his stronger options now. It gives him much more ways to approach from the air, much more ways to get over. You don't want to spend as much time thinking about where Rashid is anymore. You more so need to think about what you can do to hit him that works either way. Some attack that works whether or not he does the full thing, or could possibly stop him if he did something else. While the bot will generally do this from a back jump, it's not really that much more threatening on a forward jump. In fact, the back jump is the more likely timing for a person trying to trick you or stress you out to use the move in the first place, because they're used to seeing back jumps not being dangerous. More importantly, it allows Rashid to make jumps that don't look as if they're going to reach you, then reach you. And that's probably the most important change here. This V skill is going to be a problem, and it is going to be one that a lot of people are going to think of as both dangerous and somewhat unfair. But it really is just an air dash. If you are familiar with those things, or even just the assault command from Unist, you realize you're still doing the same thing you do when you deal with any dashing character. It's just that they're in the air instead, and you have to be a little bit more proactive about one part of it. One comfort you should have is that Rashid actually, even though he can do tons of things, most of the time if you're holding back at the time he does this, just holding back normally, you're not going to get hurt by much. This mostly happens if he happens to be close enough to you to cross up. And if he is, while that's not in any way dangerous for him, and he can just basically do it for free, that's you dealing with Rashid pressure. You always did that more or less the same way, right? While it would obviously be better to learn to counterattack it, the point is more so that learning to just defend this move and not much else is still a valid way to play it. One of the bigger things it causes is for him to be safe on certain approaches, and that you're going to have to be a little bit more careful about, because you really don't want this character having the ability to launch damaging attacks that then don't leave him open. But that's the nature of his design as well, so you have to be careful about it. One good option that we have found is that whenever you think Rashid is going to do this, and for whatever reason he's probably going for a cross-up, or at least going for a pin down attack instead of just eagle spiking, just up back. He will hit you, but the thing that causes is usually so much in your favor that you don't even care. Rashid does not do a lot of damage as is. Having the basic up bat reaction in that situation is helpful because it helps you learn when and how he's moving to decide, instead of hitting up bat, let me hit this button. Let me crush counter with this button. Because he is relatively counterable. It's a lot about spacing from here. And occasionally letting yourself get hit by Eagle Spike. Not necessarily because you had no options, but because it's probably one of the least frustrating or dangerous things he does out of the V-skill. Obviously damage is damage, and you will absolutely have that player who just repeatedly does this move and does Eagle Spike. But that player is also the player who is least able to deal with it if you can counter the move when he's just starting it. And that is why we expect to see this in the form of the bat jump more often than anything else. The player wants to get away and still use it. At higher levels, you probably have a lot more to worry about, but here, the speed of the move generally means that Rashid is not going to get to hit you. At least not until you face higher level players who have specific setups for the purpose. Or he'll hit you very little, and you can spend time against the bot learning how best to utilize those spacings and timings that he does hit you for your own character. One thing it does make harder is telling the difference between an Eagle Spike from the ground and his new stuff. But unlike most characters who play this style where that's actually a real thing that you have to care about and learn, Rashid is not actually that effective. A lot of this is about learning what not to try to do, and that means you can just grind against it for a bit without having too much of a strain. Our advice, therefore, learn to deal with it by buttons or by recognizing that he hadn't done it. And understand that you do have a lot of options. He doesn't quite have the high speed recovery. It's likely to be very popular, especially if he's in a matchup where he needs to open someone else up instead. But it's not likely to be overwhelming if you practice with it enough. So we're going to end looking at Rashid and move on to Honda. In terms of our design philosophy and a lot of players' skill sets, Honda does in fact count as a zoner character. Not necessarily because he's never trying to be in your face, but he does do a good enough job of fighting from that range with the specific intent of making your life miserable from that range that we do still consider him a zoner. Which is actually the same sort of thing Abigail gets when played in that way. It is a lot more likely, though, that Honda will be specifically played that way than Abigail, which is like a half and half thing. Some people play Abigail one way, some people play Abigail the other way. But first of all, let's fix his gauges. Honda's V-skill is in here, but it's really not often used and was never that important to the bot. Meaning that you're very unlikely to see it often. For the most part, that's good. It means that overall, you don't have any drastic changes to the bot's behavior or flow as a result of the changes. And because it is more or less a power-up style stance and not an attack, it doesn't really affect that much. It's similar to how Sagat works, except that the original V-skill actually hit. But it wasn't put in here for the purpose of hitting much. The things Honda was meant to teach you and understand really aren't that changed by the fact that he very occasionally does that. In fact, if anything, it's useful in the sense that he can end up being intimidating enough to get away with doing it. And if anything, that should be your focus, I'd say. Make sure you teach yourself to not let Honda get away with this move. The bot overall, though, is unaffected in the sense that it's not going to get terribly worse at doing its job because he does the move. If anything, it will just do a good job of teaching you to recognize it and deal with it when you see it. When he is far enough away from you, it also gives him a better thing for you to deal with, because you do have to worry about his headbutt, and many of us are likely to stand there and wait for him to do things. So it actually gives him more of a power-up. Therefore, we technically suggest, if you're going to train with Honda Bot, you might as well use this V-skill, except if you're expecting him to, like... If you're always in his face, or your game plan involves being able to do this even when he's far away, then it might be a little worse. Because at the range you'd want to stand at least the other V-skill would hit and you'd be forced to block it. But overall here, he's fine. And honestly, he's fine is a good thing to be able to say about bots at this time. Generally, the good part is that if he dashes, the timing shouldn't be such on most inputs of the bot that he will dash into this move. He also generally shouldn't jump and then immediately do it. Meaning, overall, his timing for using it should be decent relative to other options in terms of timing. Now, the inputs required to get Honda to do this properly are quite difficult because the input that contains the V skill is one of his harder inputs, meaning that you may see a bit more shift or problems relative to your version of Honda Bot, depending entirely on that input. Overall, though, we still don't expect it to be terribly disruptive. If anything, it just adds more to your mental stack, which is a good thing to have when you're planning to train against the bot for a long time. You don't want it to become too easy and start to feel as if you're just doing normal things. holding your focus on the things required to beat him, while occasionally being potentially even lured into dealing with that move, can be interesting. What it does change somewhat is that he will do sumo splash a little less. Not much at all, but a little less. Your overall practice should not be affected, because again, on most inputs he will have a rhythm similar to Sagat, where this move gets used a lot more after his own managing to knock you down than just, hey, I'm whiffing this in neutral. It's hidden well enough that he mostly does it when he's finishing the animation for something else and getting started. That, of course, brings us to our next zoner, who is technically a grappler to most people. It's time to take a look at Abigail. Or Ed, depending, because I'm not absolutely sure that this is the correct Abigail bot. And if not, I apologize for giving the impression that we were going to be looking at Abigail and then not being able to fulfill on that, but we do need to give it at least a try. Abigail's V skill is extremely complicated. He does have good timings, he can cancel it out of things. And he's a little spammy about it, at least in our version of the bot, for various reasons. That said though, given the goals related to Abigail bot are almost all patience related, it's usually not an overwhelming problem. One of the main important things about Abigail bot is the fact that he is supposed to make you miserable. And he's very good at this because if he does get the tire working, he will eventually flick it at you. It also breaks you out of your combos, as you've noted, and depending on your timings, he will be able to do more things. Therefore, is this strictly better? Maybe. But it will cause him to stop in the middle of certain things, either way. This isn't really a change though. Now that he can part-way cancel out of things, it's a problem. But not a terribly different one than when he just used the cancel, well, quote-unquote cancel into parry and end up doing nothing. Because he actually also manages to call the tire regardless of whether or not you actually hit him most of the time, you have to get used to either stopping him from doing so really fast or recognizing whether or not you get any advantage out of it. Obviously in a match, your goal should be to deal maximum damage in that scenario. But here, it really doesn't matter as much. The bot has effectively infinite health, and whether or not you've learned to deal with the situation is a lot more on you. Since it does a decent job of stopping you from approaching him in certain ways, you can consider it useful to understand. With his current timing, he's unlikely to actually cancel it out of the Abigail punch, though, meaning that you don't get quite the full effectiveness of this. But that is a very important thing to understand. How soon do I have to hit Abigail to prevent the tire from even happening? Because Abigail players are absolutely the type of people that will look at that scenario and decide, no, I can spare the HP. I can let you hit me and deal with this that way. So get used to that. Because he does have enough options of where to send that tire once he's ready, that you can't just decide, oh, it's fine, I don't care if he does this or not. Setups start to happen. While we won't have anything specific for it, learning to take what damage you can get from a single long strike can be important. In this case, damage you can get being full super for some people. Not everyone, but it's definitely worth your time sometimes. That is probably among your better options if you happen to be either jumping or dashing at him at the time he attempts to activate this. So you can often use that to check the same sort of thing. Am I close enough to actually dash up and throw him before he actually gets his tire to come at me? Depending on your character, this is easy or hard. For example, Chun-Li has it easy because she has a 15 frame dash. Zangief, probably not so much. If you're too far out to otherwise get control of it, then yeah, just getting into the range of the throw is important. But it's a little misleading, so you do have to be careful when you think you are in throw range and you're really not. As that is among the best option setups Abigail can have for calling the tire. When you think you're close enough to grab him and you are not, is a big problem. Overall, otherwise the bot is mostly unchanged, if not already improved, because, simply put, the tire is slightly better than the parry at the spaces and timings he often does it. Therefore, while we're not necessarily suggesting this is the better way to do it, it's certainly not a big problem. If you let him get the tire out, as mentioned, he does get setups. He may not use them too much, but he does have them. The bot has the capacity to use 2 decent ones and 1 relatively useless one. However, most of the success or failure of the setups have more to do with where you are on the screen relative to Abigail than anything else. In general, he will not call the tire at a timing that leads into his better setups if he is further away than mid-screen. At mid-screen, his timing is such that he may get something. Like that. Of course, at mid-screen, you have no reason to leave him alone long enough for this unless your character's dash is terrible. But as you can see there, please note it and practice this part of it. It looks as if you can throw Abigail, but the way his hitbox works, it's more likely that even if you dash, you have to walk up to him to throw him. And depending on your character's walk speed and dash speed, this may not be possible. So be careful about it. See there? This is a matter of recognizing the spacing for that move as a whole and understanding when you can and cannot do something about it. Abigail is just that sort of character where you have to get used to the idea of throwing him out of things. But that brings us round to the last one we have scheduled for tonight, specifically Ed. Ed is another character that's going to end up getting shown on more than one stream. This is because, as far as I remember, we have two very slightly different Ed bots as we were testing the best way to make Ed's V-Trigger 2 effective. To be honest, I don't remember which is which, but given the easy access to testing locations, I'm going to bet that this is the one with the V-Trigger 2 active. While Ed is definitely not a zoner by most standards, and we're about to show off something that makes him even less so, he is functional enough at it, especially against certain characters, that you have to care. And it's always important to see what changes happen if you've ever used a bot for a particular purpose. This does in fact make it slightly easier because Ed's V skill inputs are built around making sure that he has specific abilities. Different versions of the bot, therefore, also have different abilities. This version does have both the downswing style of the sway and should, if rarely, have the forward moving form of it. In general, the downswing form is slightly more useful, but you can modify your Edbot most of the time to do whatever you need the most. Generally, you can expect to see that one on any bot that wasn't intended to mostly put stuff in front of people. The way you choose to learn against Ed is of course entirely up to you. And given the very strict timings, a lot of his inputs are stressful to change in the way required. Therefore, overall you should consider that you don't have to care that much. Regardless of which version of Edbot you manage to input, he's just using one more move that isn't necessarily that meaningful directly. Most of us have learned to deal with the specific method Ed uses to get his V-Skill 1 grab working, and the bot was never particularly good at it. In addition, if you went to the trouble of anything meant to increase his ability to use his V-Skill sorry, his V trigger too, because of watching any of our streams related to that, he still has the same sort of long-range grab, just much less, well, much more safe on his side, meaning you don't really mind. The same spacings and timings and ways of thinking about the game probably remained. Overall, if you have no other option, just change the action 4, I believe it is, to make sure that he does the version of the move that you care about more, and hopefully the input isn't too hard. He does weave through attacks this way, but it generally doesn't affect the way you fight Ed because of what fighting Ed is mostly about. It's mostly about getting punishes and understanding when Ed is going to move and when you can therefore move yourself. It is actually for this reason that this seems a little better. If he doesn't spend that much time using the forward rushing version of his V skill, then you actually have to pay attention. He will continue to zone you longer. He will continue to put buttons in front of you longer. Making it a little bit easier on the part of your mind that is trying to learn how to deal with them, even if not necessarily easier on your actual playing. This is one of those moves where we expect to see a lot more creative things come from players, and eventually if that does happen, we may do something with the bot. Or make a new bot with whatever it is they come up with that is useful. But that has a lot more to do with whether or not it can be a way to change Ed's entire game plan. Because if it is not, you're likely to see the same sort of things you're seeing now. Forward and backward movement, specific jumps, either minimal footsies or very, very precise footsies. And since we already have a bot for that purpose and found it very difficult to specifically make Ed play footsies, no, not impossible, we did figure something out, but it's hard enough that it's a pain. You'll see more of that when we see Ed again, probably in part 4. That means we've covered all the bots we planned to cover tonight. We will take one quick look at Zangief in order to clarify something about him. But don't expect that we'll be going into anything in depth, because the thing that happens does not happen in every input of the bot, and to the point where we have a lot of players with Zangief bot input, and I don't even remember which ones do it and which ones don't. But we can go with basically what looks familiar to you. Zangief bot does not generally manage to do his V skill that often. It's hidden down in an input that should almost always prevent him from using it. But if you happen to train with him in V trigger too, his rhythm does change enough that there's a potential to see it in certain situations. And we haven't taken a strong look at Zangief since he got his very minor changes even before. And now he has even more of them. Meaning that the timing for a lot of things does get changed around. That said, this is again not that meaningful. Playing against this bot with it using V trigger to Cossack muscle is quite different from the main goals of it. And the very occasional use of the V skill in particular ways doesn't tend to affect too much. Interestingly, as a character's input, we press that V skill a lot, but generally it's around the timing where it should almost always be hidden in something else. So despite the vast number of V skill inputs you see, he's likely to use it only as a counter in very specific timing situations, and those situations are not likely to come up too often. They have more so to do with you attempting to stop him from doing something and not managing to get off a full combo or a knockdown or anything that actually controls Zangief's movement. So again, don't expect too much. We're however going to change him to V trigger 1 just for a moment. Hopefully he'll do it within a couple of tries, and if he doesn't, that'll be the end of our stream, as there is no way to force the event I'm talking about in a contest that makes any sense. If you've input him correctly, Zangief should have a single hidden crouching V skill input. But because he will almost always activate his V trigger or use his V trigger at that time, and his V gauge is generally allowed to be maximum, once again, you're not going to see this move. Oh, there he goes. But that was not really helpful because it doesn't apply to what I'm talking about. That's just in there to show you that, hey, if you input him right, he has it. However, it does do a good job of showing that for the most part, most Zangief bot input in what we would consider the standard way are not going to have any effect based on this whatsoever, and the fact that he can do the move is unlikely to affect anything. There we go. We did get it this time. So please note that he does have the capacity to do one move, and depending on how you let him get away with that move, if you're late, he may use the counter. And that's it. You can look out for probably another stream on Friday, but it might be the one we don't do. Oddly, we were expecting this Christmas stream to be the one that we did not do, and the Friday one to be normal, but it looks like that's going to get reversed. As for tomorrow, you can join us for Kame House, almost certainly. And next week, we're back to Street Fighter V on the Monday. Whether or not we end up having the New Year's stream for part 3 or possibly 4 of this, you're more likely to see that than you are the Friday stream, almost certainly. And then the Friday following would end up being the next one. So, we'll go into Zangief in more detail later on a different account. For tonight, we are done with this disc guidance. Thank you for tuning in. This has been Rillian for Team2MK. You can find all our bots at 2-mk.org, and all our information on our streams and releases of the bots on our Twitter 2_MK_FGC. Good luck with your training, and good night everyone.